December 796. Æthelflæd, king of the Mercians, dies. He has ruled for 141 days. His father offers carefully constructed hegemony, 39 years of administrative control, currency monopoly, and diplomatic prestige, begins to unravel. Within 30 years, Mercia will lose Kent, East Anglia, Sussex, and Essex. Within 60 years, Vikings will control half the kingdom. Within a century, Mercia itself will cease to exist as an independent power. But someone would figure out how to make hegemony survive. Not through personal authority, not through diplomatic marriages, not through forced succession, through infrastructure. Her name was Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, and she would build a network of fortresses that would outlast her enemies, and become the foundation of England itself. This is Samuel Stephen Chronicles. I'm Samuel Stephen. This is episode 2 of the Mercian Series, The Lady's Fortresses. To understand Æthelflæd, start in 878. Somerset, the marshes around Æthelflæd. Alfred, king of Wessex, is in hiding. The Viking Great Army has conquered Northumbria, destroyed East Anglia, and driven Alfred from his own kingdom. He commands perhaps a few hundred men. The future of English Christianity, English literacy, English independence, all of it depends on what happens in the next few months. Alfred has a daughter, probably 7 or 8 years old. Her name is Æthelflæd. She grows up in a world where survival is not guaranteed, where kingdoms fall in a single campaign season, where the difference between civilization and collapse is measured in how many men you can raise, how quickly you can move them, and whether you can hold territory after you've taken it. Alfred survives. He wins the Battle of Edington in 878. He forces the Viking leader Guthrum to accept baptism and withdraw to East Anglia. He buys time, and then he does something no English king has done before. He builds a system, not just an army, not just alliances. A network of fortified towns, burhs, spaced roughly 20 miles apart across Wessex. Close enough that every farm, every village, every estate sits within a day's march of safety. The burhs aren't just refugees, they're administrative centres, mints, markets, courts, nodes of royal authority embedded in the landscape. And Æthelflæd grows up watching her father build this system, learning how fortifications create control, how infrastructure outlasts individual rulers, how power embedded in stone and earth is more durable than power held in personal loyalty. Around 886, Æthelflæd married Æthelred, ealdorman of Mercia. This is a strategic alliance. Wessex and Mercia, the only 2 English kingdoms still standing, were binding themselves together against the Viking threat. But it's not a traditional dynastic marriage where the princess disappears into her husband's household and produces heirs. The charters tell a different story. From the 890s onward, Æthelred and Æthelflæd appear together in land grants. Not Æthelred with the consent of his wife. Not Æthelred advised by Æthelflæd. They rule jointly, Æthelred et Æthelflæd, and equal partners in the administration of Mercia. By 902, Æthelred is ill, possibly a stroke, possibly some long-term degenerative condition. He still holds the title of ealdorman, but Æthelflæd is running the kingdom. And when Æthelred dies in 911, the Mercian nobles do something extraordinary. They accept Æthelflæd as sole ruler, not regent, not a dowager, not a guardian for an heir. Lady of the Mercians, full authority, sole command. A woman ruling an Anglo-Saxon kingdom in her own right. This has never happened before. It will not happen again for centuries. But the Mercian nobles accept it, because by 911, Æthelflæd has already proven what she can do. Alfred's burhs in Wessex were defensive. They created zones of safety. If Vikings raided your village, you fled to the nearest burh. The garrison held the walls while Alfred raised the army and marched to relieve the siege. The system bought time. It prevented the kind of rapid collapse that had destroyed Northumbria and East Anglia. Æthelflæd copies the spacing. 20 miles between fortifications, a day's march. Close enough for mutual support. But she changes the purpose. Her burhs aren't refugees, they're bases. 907. Chester, on the Dee estuary, 70 miles northwest of Tamworth, the traditional Mercian capital. Chester is isolated, vulnerable, exposed to Irish Norse Vikings coming across the sea. Æthelflæd fortifies it, rebuilds the Roman walls, establishes a garrison, creates a forward operating base facing west. This isn't defence, this is power projection. 912. 2 new burhs. Bridgenorth on the 7. Tamworth, the old capital, refortified and expanded. 913. Stafford, 20 miles north of Tamworth. Another anchor point. 914. 3 burhs in a single year. Edisbury in the Cheshire Plain west of Chester. Warwick, 40 miles southeast of Tamworth, a forward position pointing directly at Danish-held Derby. Cherbury on the Welsh border. 915. Runcorn on the Mersey, the northern frontier. By 915, Æthelflæd had constructed at least 10 documented fortifications. Possibly more. Not every burh appears in surviving records. Here's what that network does. Each burh controls roughly 20 miles of territory around it. Farmers within that zone owe service, labour, taxes, and military duty. Merchants trading in that zone pay tolls at the burh market. Criminals in that zone are tried in the burh court. Each burh has a mint, royal moneyers striking pennies in Æthelflæd's name, currency flowing through the system, creating economic integration. Each burh has a garrison, professional soldiers maintained by local landowners who hold estates because Æthelflæd granted them. Their loyalty runs to her, because she controls their legitimacy. And here's the crucial part. The burhs aren't isolated strongpoints. They're networked. Messages can move from Tamworth to Chester in 3 days, changing horses at Stafford and Edisbury. An army can march from Warwick to Stafford in 2 days, resupplying at Tamworth. Intelligence about Viking movements in the north reaches Æthelflæd in Tamworth within a week. She's not just building fortresses. She's building a state apparatus that can operate independently of her personal presence. And she's doing it while coordinating with her brother Edward the Elder, who's doing the same thing in Wessex and pushing into East Anglia. 909. Joint campaign. Æthelflæd and Edward raid deep into Northumbria, Viking-held territory, and force a Northumbrian army to meet them. The Vikings lose. This is reconnaissance in force, testing Viking strength. 910. The Vikings retaliate, raiding into Mercia. Æthelflæd and Edward intercept them at Tettenhall in Staffordshire. The Viking army is destroyed. 3 Viking kings were killed. Northumbria's offensive capacity was crippled for years. 912 through 916. While Æthelflæd builds burhs in the Midlands and the northwest, Edward pushes into Essex and East Anglia. They're not operating independently, they're coordinating. Edward builds a burh at Hertford. Æthelflæd builds at Warwick. Together, they create a strategic envelope around the Danish 5 boroughs: Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, Stamford, the core of Viking power in the Midlands. The 5 boroughs are isolated, cut off from reinforcement from East Anglia by Edward's burhs, cut off from Northumbria by Æthelflæd's northern fortifications, surrounded by a network of fortified English towns that can support offensive operations. This is not medieval warfare as we imagine it. No epic field battles, no heroic single combat. This is systematic territorial control, military geography, the slow constriction of an enemy's strategic options through infrastructure. Æthelflæd is strangling the 5 boroughs, and in 917, she strikes. 917. Late summer. The burh network is complete. The strategic envelope is closed. Æthelflæd has forward positions at Warwick, within striking distance of Derby. Derby is one of the 5 boroughs, Danish-held since the 870s. a fortified town with a professional garrison, the southern anchor of Viking power in the Midlands. Æthelflæd marches from Warwick, 40 miles, open ground, the kind of march that invites interception, counterattack, and ambush. But there's no Viking relief force, because Edward has simultaneously moved to Towcester, south of Derby, blocking any reinforcement from East Anglia. Derby's garrison is on its own. The siege lasts weeks. The sources don't give us details. We don't know if Æthelflæd's forces stormed the walls or starved the garrison into surrender. What we do know is the cost. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Mercian version, records it with unusual specificity. 4 of her thegns, who were dear to her, were killed within the gates. 4 senior commanders, men important enough to be named in royal councils, men whose deaths matter enough to be written down. Dear to her. This is personal loss recorded in a genre, royal chronicles, that almost never mentions emotion. But Derby falls. The Danish garrison surrenders or flees. The town is brought under English control, and that changes everything. When Derby falls, Leicester sees what's coming. Leicester is the next borough in the 5, 20 miles north of Derby, another Danish stronghold. In 918, the year after Derby, Leicester surrenders without a fight. The sources say the garrison submitted to Æthelflæd. They recognized her authority. They accepted integration into her system. Why? Because Derby proved that the burh network works, that Æthelflæd can project force deep into Danish territory, that she can coordinate with Edward to isolate targets. That resistance is futile, and submission is survivable. Leicester surrenders not because Æthelflæd has a bigger army, but because she has a better system. And then something extraordinary happens. Spring 918. Messengers arrive in Tamworth from York. York, the old Northumbrian capital, now controlled by Norse Vikings, sends an offer. The York Norse will submit to Æthelflæd. They will recognize her as overlord. They will accept integration into her kingdom. Think about what this means. York is 200 miles from Tamworth. It's been under Viking control for 50 years. It has its own kings, its own trade networks, its own ecclesiastical structure. And they're offering submission to a woman, to a Mercian, to someone they've been at war with for a generation. Why? Because the alternative is being isolated and strangled by the burh network. Because Edward controls the south, Æthelflæd controls the Midlands, and York can see that the future belongs to whoever controls fortified infrastructure. This is the moment. If Æthelflæd accepts York's submission, she becomes overlord of nearly all of England north of the Thames. The moment her grandfather Alfred spent his entire reign fighting for. The moment that would make the Viking conquest irreversible or reversible. June 12, 918. Tamworth. Æthelflæd dies. She is 47, maybe 48 years old. The cause is not recorded. Possibly illness, possibly injury. Those 4 thegns weren't the only casualties at Derby. She dies 8 weeks after the York offer arrives. Before she can formalize the submission, before she can garrison York, before she can complete what she started. The York submission falls apart. The Norse kings withdraw their offer. Northumbria remains independent. It will take another 9 years, and Æthelflæd's nephew Æthelstan to finally bring York under permanent English control. 8 weeks. That's how close Æthelflæd came to completing the conquest of Viking England. When Æthelflæd dies, her daughter Ælfwine succeeds her. The Mercian nobles accept this. Ælfwine is acclaimed as Lady of the Mercians, just as her mother was, for 6 months. Then Edward the Elder, Æthelflæd's brother, King of Wessex, marches into Mercia, deposes Ælfwine, and annexes the kingdom. Mercia ceases to exist as an independent realm. It becomes a subordinate territory under West Saxon control. Ælfwine disappears from the historical record, possibly sent to a monastery. This looks like Offa's story. Powerful ruler dies. Succession fails. Kingdom collapses. But there's a crucial difference. When Offa died, his hegemony evaporated because it was held together by personal relationships. Client kings who had submitted to Offa personally saw no reason to submit to his successor. When Æthelflæd died, her burhs didn't disappear. The fortresses stood. The garrisons remained. The mints kept striking coins. The markets kept operating. The administrative apparatus kept functioning. Edward didn't have to rebuild Mercian power. He inherited it, intact, operational, ready to use. And he did use it. In 918, the year Æthelflæd dies, Edward secures Stamford, another of the 5 boroughs. In 919, Edward takes Nottingham. In 920, Edward takes Lincoln. By 920, all 5 of the Danish 5 boroughs are under English control. Edward doesn't win these victories by being a better general than Æthelflæd. He wins them because he has the infrastructure she built. The burh network that supplies his armies controls territory behind his advance and isolates enemy strongholds. The burhs become the skeleton of England's shire system. Warwick becomes Warwickshire. Stafford becomes Staffordshire. Chester becomes Cheshire. These aren't just counties. They're administrative units built around fortified centres that Æthelflæd constructed. Units that persist for 1,000 years. Units that still exist today. The churches Æthelflæd patronised, St. Oswald's in Gloucester, St. Werburgh's in Chester, became major ecclesiastical centres. They maintain her memory. They preserve her legacy. St. Oswald's becomes her burial place. Her tomb becomes a pilgrimage site. For medieval chroniclers, she becomes a model of Christian rulership. Military prowess combined with piety and administrative wisdom. Compare this to Offa. Offa's dike still stands. You can walk it today. But the kingdom that built it? Gone. Offa's pennies survive in museums. But the mint monopoly that produced them? Dismantled within a generation. Offa's archbishopric at Lichfield? Dissolved 7 years after his death. Æthelflæd's burhs? They become towns, cities, and county seats. They remain centres of power for centuries. Why? Because Offa built systems that required him to exist. Æthelflæd built systems that operated independently of her presence. Offa's power was fungible. It worked anywhere he applied it. But it wasn't transferable. It died with him. Æthelflæd's power was embedded, in stone, in institutions, in geography. It couldn't be undone by her death because it didn't depend on her personal authority to function. When Edward annexes Mercia, he's not destroying Æthelflæd's work. He's absorbing it, making it part of a larger system. When Edward's son, Æthelstan, Æthelflæd's nephew, possibly raised in her court, becomes king of the English, he inherits not just Wessex, but the Mercian infrastructure his aunt built. And Æthelstan uses that infrastructure to do what Æthelflæd almost did: conquer York, unify England, and create the first kingdom of all the English. Æthelflæd's burhs make that possible. So what's the lesson? Offa built a personal monarchy. When he died, the personal relationships that sustained his power dissolved. Æthelflæd built institutional infrastructure. When she died, the institutions kept functioning. Offa's hegemony lasted 39 years and collapsed in 5. Æthelflæd's infrastructure lasted centuries and became England. Power embedded in institutions survives. Power held in persons does not. That's what Æthelflæd proved. And her nephew Æthelstan would take that lesson and make it permanent. If you visit the English Midlands today, you're walking through Æthelflæd's legacy. Warwick, Stafford, Tamworth, Chester, Derby, Leicester, all of them are modern towns or cities. All of them are regional centres. All of them built on the foundations of burhs that a woman constructed over 7 years in the early 10th century. The shire system that governed England until the 20th century, built on the skeleton of the burh network. The market towns that anchor regional economies, many of them started as Æthelflæd's fortified trading posts. The administrative geography of England, the way power is distributed across landscape, embedded in specific locations, operating through local centres, That's Æthelflæd's innovation. She didn't invent fortification. She didn't invent defensive networks. Her father Alfred did that. What she invented was offensive infrastructure. Fortifications that don't just protect, they project. Towns that don't just survive, they conquer. Offa built impressive systems: coinage, markets, ecclesiastical hierarchy, border infrastructure. But they were all extensions of his personal authority. They broadcast his power. They required him to maintain them. Æthelflæd built systems that operated without her. That functioned in her absence. That could be handed to a successor, even an unwilling successor like Edward, and keep working. That's the difference between hegemony and state building. Hegemony is personal. It requires the hegemon. When the hegemon dies, hegemony ends. State building is institutional. It creates structures that transcend individuals. When the builder dies, the structures remain. Æthelflæd died in 918. But her fortresses didn't. And those fortresses, those patient, methodical, unglamorous constructions of stone and earth and organizational capacity, became the foundation of the first unified English kingdom. Next time on the Mercian Series, Æthelstan's consolidation. How Æthelflæd's nephew took the infrastructure she built, combined it with his grandfather Alfred's vision, and created something neither of them lived to see. One kingdom, one law, one coinage. England. This has been Episode 2 of the Mercian Series on Samuel Stephen Chronicles. If you'd like to read more about how institutions shape power and how systems outlast their builders, subscribe to the newsletter on Substack at samuelstephenchronicles.com. The next episode will be released in 2 weeks. Until then, remember, the most effective power is the kind that survives the person who built it.